do this. Here we go. All right, so welcome, friends. Good to have you all here. This is our third week in the book of Genesis, and we've been thrilled to have Paul guide us through these important texts that really set up all of Scripture and help us understand just what kind of a story we're in, what kind of a world we're in, and what it means to be a person in the world that God has created. One of the people who helped me love Scripture was Gordon Fee, and Gordon Fee just passed away this week, and he worked there at the college where Paul is now for a long time. So I thought I'd read a prayer for us that I first heard before one of Gordon's lectures one day to help set us up for reading Scripture tonight. So let's pray together. Sovereign and compassionate God, who through your only and beloved Son has shown us manifold mercies, we offer you heartfelt thanks and praise for this world created in sevenfold goodness, for all your creatures on the earth, in the sea, and in the heavens. For not only do we enjoy their wonderful variety, their riotous color, their peculiar ways, but through them, you remind us that you are a God whose ways are past our finding out. We thank you that you have endowed us with the priceless gift of not only knowing the good, but even more of knowing the inexpressible joy of doing the good. Open our hearts to your love and our minds to your wisdom, and teach us your ways. And as in the days of old, may you, through your most powerful and gracious word, these holy scriptures, unmake and remake us according to the image of your dear Son. That is Jesus, whom you love, and through whom we have our redemption, the forgiveness of our sins. We ask all these things in his strong name. Amen. So Paul, let's pass it over to you as we do week 3 here in the book of Genesis.
Okay, thank you so much, Dan, and thank you for referencing Gordon Fee, who was my teacher as well many years ago, and I honor his memory, and I'm grateful for all the things that I learned from him, from his teaching on the Bible. And one of the books that he wrote was How to Read the Bible for All It's Worth. And one of the key insights of that book is that each part of the Bible needs to be read as much as possible on its own terms. And so one of the things that we're always trying to do is to try to understand the kind of book that we're reading so that we can read it on its own terms, rather than just bringing to that book sort of our own expectations and forcing it to kind of be what we want it to be, but to try to hear what it is in fact, so that we can hear the message from it. Let me say this in terms of our time together. I know that some of you like to keep your cameras off, and that's okay, but it is helpful for me if I see people and faces. So if you are able to turn your camera on and you don't mind turning it on, then why not just do that? Because it's almost like we're together then, rather than talking to names, So, hey, there's some more people. Good to see you all. Of course, if you're in your pajamas and feeling uncomfortable, that's okay too then. This is, the book of Genesis is one of those books where you really feel like it would be so much better if we were sitting around by the fire. I'm sitting in our living room, we've got a fireplace. It would be great to be sitting together, because it's not so much that anyone needs it taught to them as we need to think together and talk about what it evokes in us, because these stories are so rich and so foundational to the rest of the Bible and to how we come to understand what it means to be a human in God's world, to be a creature in the world that God created, the Creator created. And in a sense, it's in the talking and reflecting together that new truths keep on coming out. So I'm just aware that, whatever thoughts I can share with you, it'll just be some small percentage of all the depth of meaning and richness that is there for us. In fact, at the supper table tonight, Bronwyn and Elliot, our oldest son, and I were just sitting at the table and talking about this chapter that we're going to be reading today. And just so many ideas and thoughts were coming out. And I hope we can have a little bit of that kind of a conversation tonight as well. So I will pause along the way and invite you all to join in. So you'll recall that last time in chapter 3, we read the story that is sometimes referred to as the story of the fall, where the first human couple become alienated from the garden because they contravened God's limitation that he had placed on their eating of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And that chapter ends with this divine limitation that's placed on them. There's a curse that's placed on them. There's hardship that is introduced into the story, and they're banished from the garden, and they are no longer, they're driven out. They're driven out to the east of Eden. That's become a motif in literature. They're driven out of the garden, and they're blocked from returning into that space. And that's one of the themes that we'll see played out in a number of these stories that we're going to look at in the next few chapters. In fact, it's almost like some of these next chapters, like the story of Cain and Abel, is like another version of a fall story. It's another kind of sort of falling away from the purposes of the Creator for the world and for human community and so on. This plays out now in the context of two brothers. So the Garden of Eden story, the story of the fall, is the story of this alienation that comes between the man and the woman. So that's kind of a fundamental aspect of human alienation. And another aspect of the human condition, you could say, is hostility that exists between brothers. And by brothers, I don't just mean literal brothers. I mean the alienation that exists between kind of on the horizontal sphere between parts of humanity. So if you think of brothers as representative of ethnicities or of tribes or of countries or of whole communities, this story seems to be about the alienation of brother to brother, and it anticipates many other brother conflicts that are going to happen even in the book of Genesis. So I'm sure you can immediately think, if I say, who are the other brother conflicts that come to mind? You immediately think of perhaps Jacob and Esau, right? There's a fundamental brother conflict that's a part of the story. And another very important brother conflict is Joseph and Joseph's brothers. And there's incredible antagonism and hostility between them that shapes the story of Israel much later on. And there are other stories too. If you go, think of the sons of David, and there's Absalom and his brothers who are at war with each other. So this story is about something that's at the heart of the human condition, this idea of alienation from each other. And, in the book of Psalms, you've got this hopefulness about the overcoming of that alienation. You think about Psalm 133, one of the Psalms of Ascent, which talks about the hope and the blessedness of brothers living together in harmony. How blessed it is when brothers live together in harmony. So this is an important theme in Scripture. And it made me think, when I was reading through this and preparing, it reminded me also of the Sermon on the Mount. Remember when Jesus says, if you're at prayer and you are about to make your offering and you remember that your brother has something against you, you better make that right, because your brother alienation is going to be a block between your ability to relate to God. And then it's in that same context in the Sermon on the Mount, you'll recall that Jesus also says that if you hate your brother, or you call your brother a fool, that is tantamount to murder. And some commentators have suggested that Jesus is actually riffing on the story of Cain and Abel. So, the hostility between the brothers comes between their ability, or Cain's ability, to relate to God. So this is a story with deep resonances in the Bible and with kind of the human condition. So let's just go through it kind of quickly in a way. We're introduced now. It says that Adam made love to his wife Eve, and she became pregnant, and she gave birth to Cain. And she said, with the help of the Lord, I brought forth a man. And later she gave birth to the brother Abel. Now Abel kept flocks and Cain worked the soil. So the story is set up as a kind of conflict between farmers and shepherds. That kind of takes us back into kind of this agrarian kind of society. And some people have suggested that perhaps in the very earliest form of this story, as it was maybe told around a campfire, it was kind of told as if, kind of about these kind of warring parts of ancient society. And it says that in the course of time, Cain brought some of the fruits of the soil as an offering to the Lord. And Abel also brought an offering, fat portions from some of the firstborn of his flock. The Lord looked with favor on Abel and his offering, but on Cain and his offering, he did not look with favor. So Cain was very angry and his face was downcast. Now, here's something for us just to pause on. This story has got so many kind of gaps in it. And this is typical of the stories of this very early part of kind of primordial history, is that there's so much of the story just is not explained. We are not told what it was about Cain's offering that was not acceptable to God, or what it was about Abel's that was so favorable. In later tradition, like in the book of Hebrews, if you go to the book of Hebrews at chapter 11, it references Abel's offering and says that it was made by faith. But in this story, right here as we read it, you don't get a sense of the specifics of what it was that made the one offering favorable and the other unfavorable. And so there's a sense in which Cain sort of stands for all people who think that life is unfair, because there's something about it that to his mind seems arbitrary. He's angry and his face is downcast. And so there's this kind of built-in kind of mystery in a way. There's a mystery to life for all of us, is that, why is one person wealthy and another person poor? Why is one person got an incredible heritage and another person doesn't? Why is one person born in this country and another person in that country? Why, you can just think of all of the inequalities of our lives. And Cain and Abel kind of represent that. There's the one person has got favor and the other person's got disfavor. And the person who's got disfavor is angry about it. And the Lord says to him, why are you angry? Why is your face downcast? If you do what is right, will you not be accepted? So even the disfavored person still has access to God. I mean, it's interesting to notice here that even post-Eden, God is still hanging out with the people. Like he's still there as a character in the story. So, it's not as if somehow God is completely absent yet, although, later on that seems to be the case. But here he is still there interacting with them. And there's a warning that God gives to Cain. He says, if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you, but you must rule over it. And so this is a very important moment in the story, because sin is described not just as a kind of, breach of virtue or like doing the wrong thing or something like that. Sin is described as a force, as a wild animal that's crouching at the door, and it's up to Cain to control it. And the thing that's crouching at his door right now is precisely his anger. It's his sort of sense that, hey, life isn't fair. God's being wrong to me. This isn't right. I'm going to do something about it. And so there's resentment. That's kind of what's crouching at his door. So sin is like, it's this animal that's about to rise up and consume him. And he's got the choice, or he's got the ability. God says, you must rule over it. But he doesn't rule over it, right? The tragedy of the story is that Cain is completely consumed by this thing that crouches at his door, and he becomes the wild animal himself. In the next verse, it says, while they were in the field, Cain attacked his brother Abel and killed him. And then we've got this, amazingly famous verse. The Lord said to Cain, where's your brother Abel? He says, I don't know, he replied. Am I my brother's keeper? So that phrase kind of resounds through the history of human alienation. Why are you asking me about my brother? He's not my responsibility. So that breakdown, this denial of responsibility that God calls to him and says, where is your brother? Of course, God knows exactly what's happened. He says, what have you done? Listen, your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground. And it's this amazing picture of an enchanted universe, you could say, where blood can cry out, where the earth itself somehow revolts kind of at the shedding of blood that has happened. And Cain is kind of distanced even from the earth that he's standing on. He says, so this is why I said this is like another fall, because it's like, just like the first couple, there was this curse that is placed on the earth. Now there's another curse. It says, now you are under a curse and driven from the ground, just like Adam and Eve had been driven from the garden. Now, Cain, who had been a person who worked the soil, he's now alienated from his own kind of identity and his roots, you could say. You're driven from the ground, which opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you work the ground, it will no longer yield its crops for you. You will be a restless wanderer on the earth. So see, it's like a second fall story. Just like there was 2 creation stories, now there's a second fall story. You could say it's the ongoing unfolding of the fall. Adam and Eve had their particular kind of test, and now Cain has failed his test, the test of living in harmony with his brother. And then Cain says to the Lord, my punishment is more than I can bear, this punishment of being sort of banished from the land and having to wander. And today you're driving me from the land, and I will be hidden from your presence. I will be a restless wanderer on the earth, and whoever finds me will kill me. So notice there how, there's lots of questions about things and details in the story, but it assumes there's lots of people in the world. And if he goes from place to place, he's going to find people, right? So if you were being super kind of pedantic about this, you could say, but hang on, there's only Adam and Eve and there's 2 kids. Like who else is there? But that, you kind of have to suspend that and kind of say, okay, there's lots of people in the world. And wherever he goes, there's going to be people, and people are going to know that he's been displaced from his God-given role, which was to be a tiller of the soil. And now he's wandering. People are going to kill me. But the Lord says to him, not so. Anyone who kills Cain will suffer vengeance 7 times over. And then the Lord put a mark on Cain so that no one who found him would kill him. So Cain went out from the Lord's presence and lived in the land of Nod, east of Eden. So again, this reference to east of Eden, which was there at the end of chapter 3, and now again with Cain, east of Eden is kind of this sort of stands for the place kind of outside of God's presence. He goes out from God's presence and has to live in a world that is much more hostile than he had known before. But there's this mark that's on him, which is both a punishment and a grace to him, because he is going to be protected because he's got this mark, and yet the mark also marks him out for who he is. So it's a kind of an interesting kind of double-edged kind of thing there. So then we've got a little bit of the story of Cain, Cain's genealogy. One of the things that the book of Genesis does is it joins together different stories by genealogies, right? By giving you kind of like a little family history. In this case, there's 7 generations in the family history that gives you a sense of completeness. We're being told everything you need to know about Cain and his line. And this is kind of like setting us up for how the Bible thinks about that part of the human race, which is really the majority of the human race, that is not within the particular focus that the book wants to talk about. The book, we'll see later on that the story is going to focus in on one family, but this is to set the scene for kind of everything. And so here we've got this first kind of laying the foundations of how the Bible thinks about humanity. And so it gives us these 7 generations that come from Cain, who was the one who is being cast out from God's presence. So Cain has a wife who, we don't know where she came from. She becomes pregnant. She gives birth to someone called Enoch. This is not the Enoch who's famous is another one. This is an earlier Enoch. This interesting bit here says that Cain was then building a city. And so Cain is associated with city building. It's the first city in the Bible. And so you could say civilization, the built environment of civilizations and empires, are here attributed to coming from Cain. Okay, so this brother conflict that characterizes Cain is built into the world of empires and cities and the world of commerce and all of those things that you associate with cities. So he's the one who builds the city. He named it after his son Enoch, and then it lists these various people. And then we get down to verse 19. Lamech married two women, one named Ada, and the other one Zillah. Ada gave birth to Jabal, and he was the father of those who live in tents and raise livestock. His brother's name was Jubal. He was the father of all who play stringed instruments and pipes. And Zillah also had a son, Tubal-Cain, who forged all kinds of tools out of bronze and iron. And Tubal-Cain's sister was Naamah. The interesting things there that people point out is that in this line from Cain, where not only is the city built, but you have the beginnings of culture, where you've got the reference to music, musical instruments, wind instruments, pipes, and so on, and also the working of metal, so making of things out of metal, which could be artistry. It could also be tools and implements and instruments and that sort of thing. But so you've got the city is the place of culture, but it's also the place of violence, because you see the implicit violence in the warning that comes next. Lamech says to his wife, so this is the son of Enoch, so it's kind of part down the line from Cain, a couple of generations. He says to his wives, Ada and Zillah, listen to me. Wives of Lamech, hear my words. I have killed a man for wounding me, a young man for injuring me. If Cain is avenged 7 times, because earlier on it said that if Cain gets killed, God will avenge him 7 times. If Cain is avenged 7 times, then Lamech 77 times. And so that kind of warning that Lamech gives is characteristic, you could say, of this whole tribe of humanity, that built into the brother hostility is this sense of vengeance, of taking revenge on any harm that's done to you, much more than you received. So 7 times, and then 70 times 7, or 77 times. And that, of course, reminds us, the echo, I'm sure many of you are thinking, hey, hang on, that's when Jesus was telling Peter about, how many times should a person be forgiven? Should it be 7 times? He said, no, 77 times. And in a sense, it's to overturn the inherent blood, the blood feuding that is at the heart of human culture, you could say, in order to genuinely root out the desire for vengeance that characterizes human alienation and hostility. The forgiveness has to go much deeper than 1 time or 7 times, but 77 times. Okay, so that's the story of Cain. So let me open it up there. We can pause. So many other things we could touch on, but I'd love to hear what your thoughts are. What if something was triggered for you, or you had a thought? Go ahead.
Hi, Paul. I had a bit of a question from that story.
Great.
Maybe without going on maybe a big rabbit trail, but I was wondering if maybe you could comment on this biblical idea of the city, and maybe if it relates in some way to technology, like these descendants. And because in Revelation, of course, it ends with the New Jerusalem, which is like the redeemed city. But is there maybe something succinct or interesting you could say about this biblical idea of the city?
Succinct or interesting? That's a great line. I think, the city is the place of culture, and it's the place also for the potential for rebellion against God. So in a little bit later on in chapter 10, there's a reference to the Tower of Babel, and in effect, it's a city as well. So the city is the place that characterizes human aspiration to be great and powerful. And I think of the Tower of Babel story as another kind of fall story. It's another version of this story as well. It's another place where you see the people seeking to be like God. So remember in chapter 3, the concern was that the people were trying to be like God, and the Tower of Babel story is about that too. It's about this idea that people are trying to be like God. So I think the city is it's a place of many things, and it's ultimately, I mean, as you rightly say, the great city at the end of the Bible is the place of God's unmediated presence. It's the place where the tree of life from the Garden of Eden is now within a city. So it comes together in the end. Here we see them alienated from each other, divergent, but ultimately they come together. It's a place of culture. It's a place of refuge. The cities are walled, so they're places of safety. They're also the place where you have the temple, so God's presence is experienced in the city. The outside of the city is often thought of as a place of wild animals and danger. But there's also a sense in which at times the way of the Lord can only be found by leaving the city. So, you think of Jesus who went into the wilderness, had to get away from the city because the city becomes corrupt. The city has got so much potential for good, but it's also got so much potential for corruption and for being led astray and so on. So Jesus has to go out into the wilderness in order to pray. And, the prophets talk about the way of the Lord is in the wilderness. So yeah, there's an interesting dynamic that plays all the way through the Bible, the kind of the city and the wilderness that's kind of counterparts to each other.
Thank you. That's a really interesting answer.
Yeah, you're welcome. And then Jadine, is that your hand up? Is that a question? Jadine?
Yes. I'm still trying to wrap my head to blow away the teachings from before, where the first brother, their first people, and now you've been teaching us that it's, it's not like a literal story or factual or scientific. So there's lots of people on earth when Cain and Abel were around, like there's lots of people around at that time and gathering.
Well, it just sort of implies they are, doesn't it? Because, when he goes out, he's worried that he's going to get killed by somebody, and he marries somebody, right? So it's this is what I said, where the story has lots of gaps, and there's sort of incongruities. There's sort of things you kind of go, "Huh, where'd that person come from?" And in a way, it's not the kind of story that is not offering you answers to those questions. So at some point you have to say, okay, I've got all these kind of detailed questions, and it's not going to answer those questions. So what are the deeper questions or the bigger questions that it is going to answer? And so it wants us to think. It's a kind of invitation for us to focus on the stuff it's interested in, and it's interested in this question of how there's this brother conflict. There's how Cain is cared for by God and yet also punished by God. There's the development of human society, and the thing that we'll see as we go along is that there's a trajectory. So if I just look to the verses ahead, in verse 25, it says, Adam and Eve come together again, and she gives birth to a son named Seth. This is a very important moment because Seth replaces Abel. Okay, so it says, God has granted me another child in place of Abel since Cain killed him. So here we've got now an alternative story to the Cain story. So the Cain story is set us on a certain kind of trajectory. It's going to go in a direction, and it's going to bring us to where we all live and are right now. The Cain story takes us kind of down into human history, in which there's war and conflict and suffering and interpersonal violence and all of those kinds of things. But what is going to happen now is that there's another story that offsets that dominant story. And that's the part of the story that is woven through the biblical story. And it shows how God is going to track with this minority group that are part of the biggest story. And that's where the real focus of it's going to be. So in a way, Cain is almost like just sort of laying the foundation. That's what we all know is true. We all know about this violence and all of that. But here's something important, because it says, God has given me another child in the place of Abel. So Abel, who made the righteous offering, was killed. So then the fear might be, now righteousness has gone out of the world. Before it even got going, it's dead and it's lost. But God provides a replacement for Abel. God has granted me another child in place of Abel. And then it says, at that time, people began to call on the name of the Lord. And to call on the name of the Lord, of course, is a way that the Bible is an expression that talks about the true worship of the Lord, of Yahweh. So here you've got, you might say, is pre-Israelites Yahweh worship. So these people are not Israelites, right? This is long before even Abraham, right? So this is where you've got kind of somehow, by the grace of God, built in to the human race, there's this small strand of people who are worshiping Yahweh. We're given no details about them. We don't know why they worship Yahweh. Kind of like Abel. Why did Abel do something that was righteous? How did he know how to be righteous? Later on, we'll be introduced to Noah, and we'll find out that he's a righteous person. How did he know? These are mysteries that the Bible never gives us, but we're encouraged to think about them and to follow them in a, kind of narratively, kind of notice their story and think of ourselves as belonging to them. When we get to the book of Hebrews, many, many centuries later, it talks about those people who had faith. And the wonderful bit that I love about Hebrews chapter 11 is it says that without us, that line of people wouldn't have been completed, that we belong to those people. The people of faith now belong to those people of faith down through the centuries. So here at the end of chapter 4, we're introduced to this alternate line from Cain. So the story of Cain and his violence is not the only story, which is a great grace. Okay, then we get to chapter 5. We've got another genealogy. It says, this is the written account of Adam's family line. When God created mankind, notice how this is like another little summary of the story so far. When God created mankind, he made them in the likeness of God. He created them male and female and blessed them. Okay, that takes us all the way back to chapter 1. And he named them mankind, or Adam. Adam, the word Adam, of course, just means mankind. He named them that when they were created. When Adam had lived 130 years, he had a son in his own likeness, in his own image, and he named him Seth. So it's a very interesting statement, that, because it's like, so it's repeating the very beginning of the story. God made made humanity, made Adam, male and female. He made them, and he made them in his own image. Then Adam had a son in his own likeness and in his own image. And so there's this kind of genealogy that is now passing on the image kind of by birth, kind of from one to the other. But there's a slight sense of distance now, isn't there? I mean, maybe I'm overreading that, but it's almost like it's like a secondary image. It's like Seth is in the image of Adam. Adam is in the image of God. So does that imply some kind of distance? I don't know if it does, but later on in chapter 9, for example, where we're told that, you shouldn't commit murder. The reason that we shouldn't commit murder is because it says, for in the image of God has God made mankind. So the image of God persists, even though there's been sin in the world. The image of God persists. Humanity still somehow reflects God or images God. But there is also a sense of distancing that comes where now you're not the directly created one, but you're the offspring of those ones, right? So it's an interesting thing to notice. Then the other really remarkable thing, of course, about this section, chapter 5, is the astronomical ages of everybody. So if you just go through the list there, you'll see how, all these people are so old. It says Seth lived 807 years, and he had other sons and daughters. Altogether, Seth lived to 912 years. And that's down from the 930 years that Adam lived. In fact, I went through in my Bible and I put a little arrow down or up just to see if there was a pattern. And there's no real pattern, although mostly the ages are going down. So one of the things you notice is they're astronomically high. Adam lives 930 years. Seth lives 912 years. Enosh lives 905 years. Kenan lives 910 years. So it went up a bit. Then Mahalalel lived 895 years, going down. Then there's Enoch, who no, there was Jared. He lived 962 years. Then there's Enoch. We'll come back to Enoch because he's an exception. And then there is Methuselah, who is the longest of all, 969 years. And then it's all down from there. Lamech, 770 years, and so on. So then eventually, when you get to chapter 6, when things have got really bad, it's now the world has got a lot of evil in it. God becomes frustrated with humans, and he says, my spirit will not contend with humans forever, for they are mortal. Their days will be 120 years. So in chapter 6, verse 3, there's a cap placed on humans at 120 years. So that whole theme is kind of fascinating. Of course, people have speculated and wondered about it. I think myself, it just belongs to this kind of story where it's so far long ago that, amazing things happen that don't happen now, that kind of a feeling. But the significant point is that when God puts a limit on the people in chapter 6, verse 3, it's like the other limitations that we've seen in the story. The first limitation was to exclude the children, the people from the Garden of Eden. Later on, there's going to be another limit, which is to scatter the languages of the people who are kind of trying to build a great city. Cain was banished from the land and had to wander. There was another limitation. So there are these various limitations that God is placing onto the people as they constantly kind of revolt or rebel against the terms of God's world. And God insists on kind of not just letting them run their own way, but is constantly sort of steering, guiding, limiting, and kind of corralling, you could say, to try to get the human race to live in the way that he wants them to live. So then if we just go back a little bit to chapter 5, verse 24, there's an important phrase there, because in the list of all of these people, it doesn't say that much about them, except for Enoch, it says he walked faithfully with God. And that's a very important phrase. And it's repeated of only one other person in the story, and that, of course, is Noah, right? So in chapter 5, verse 22, Enoch walked faithfully with God. And then if you look down at chapter 6, verse 9, Noah was a righteous man, blameless among the people of his time, and he walked faithfully with God. So there's these moments where someone stands out, and there's this key phrase that's used, that he walked faithfully with God. We don't know why they walked faithfully with God. Like, what was it about them that made them do that? But that's what marked them out. And in both cases, both Enoch and Noah, something very special happens to that person. both of them are rescued from the wrath of God, you could say, from God's punishment that comes on the world. In Enoch's case, he doesn't die. It says Enoch walked faithfully with God in verse 24. Then he was no more because God took him. So that is usually understood to mean that God took Enoch to himself, okay, to be with himself. And now we don't know the details of what that means, but later tradition in Jewish, later Jewish interpretation and speculation and so on, is the idea that Enoch was taken up to heaven, kind of taken into the heavenly realm, and kind of became a kind of sort of, you know, he was sort of taken up into the heavenlies and sort of taken to God's presence, kind of a thing. Then, of course, in Noah's case, Noah and his family are given safe passage through the flood by being told about how to build an ark and all the specifications of how to do that. So both of them receive this special blessing of salvation, you could say. And in both cases, it's because we're told that they walked faithfully with God. Okay, so let me pause there too. Again, just any thoughts, any questions you have about any of those bits that we've covered there.
There's a question here in the chat, Paul. Teresa says that if we have that category of theological parable to understand these stories, why the genealogies? Why try and list these family orders? I remember, like Paul Wyatt said before, you know, why this interest in the family lines?
Yeah,
all this family succession.
Yeah, the genealogies are very difficult to figure out what they're for and how they work and all of that. So these stories are not exactly parables. I mean, when I say parables, what I mean is something like, you know, treat them like a parable, but they're not actually parables. They're ancient primordial history of a kind that is telling us kind of about the foundations of the world. And the genealogies do a number of things. One thing that they do is they create a sense of continuity. They create a sense of generations that are passing, the passage of time. They create the sense of a lineage, of a line, of a long-standing history. They also create a sense of kinship, of who belongs to whom. So you can say, here's a family group, and they've got certain characteristics, and here's another family group, and they've got characteristics. So it's just a very human thing as well. You know, I mean, certainly in traditional societies, maybe more so than ours, but traditional societies always, genealogies identify who we are. You know, we are the son of so-and-so, the son of so-and-so, the son of so-and-so kind of thing. That's the placing of oneself within a bigger story. And I think that's part of what's going on with these genealogies. It's showing a sense of continuity, of kinship, of bonds between different people and so on. And it's creating the sense of a passage of time and of how ancient things are. You know, I mean, just think about how many hundreds of years this story has covered. You know, we've just been racing along here through history. We're now many, many hundreds of years beyond the story of Adam and Eve. And that's created by the genealogy. So that chapter 6 is like a long time after chapter 3. So the genealogy helps you to create that sense of the passage of time. But you know, you could read on this, and the commentators will say something like, "We don't really know why this is here," but it's a part of the shaping of these the narratives, as you can see. So then the other big thing that happens, of course, is the downward trend. So other than the few people like Seth, Enoch, Noah, the general trend is in the opposite direction, into more and more alienation from God. And so we get to this very strange part of the story in chapter 6. It says, when human beings began to increase in number on the earth, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of humans were beautiful, and they married any of them they chose. Then the Lord said, my spirit will not contend with humans forever, for they are mortal, and their days will be 120 years. So there God puts this limitation on people, but you can see there's a sense of frustration that is somehow coming about because of God's, God saying, I'm not going to contend with them. There's something wrong with them, sort of like morally. And it has to do with these mysterious sons of God figures. Then in verse 4, it says, the Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterwards, when the sons of God went to the daughters of humans and had children with them. They were the heroes of old, men of renown. So this is deeply strange, friends. I won't even begin to try to tell you what I think it means. I don't really know what it means. It's somehow connected to the sort of deep kind of history, kind of like a prehistorical mindset, where you've got this idea that there were not only people on earth, and not only was there God, but there was some kind of intermediary beings as well. And so this takes you into the world of mythology, frankly. Like, this is where you're dealing with things like, Hercules and various other kinds of figures who are in between gods and people. And I think what it means in the story is that it's another kind of fall story, I would say, where even in the heavenly world, the same dynamic that is happening in the Garden of Eden, which is people broaching or sort of breaking through the boundaries that God has set in order for creation to flourish. Even in the heavenly realm, there's this breaking of boundaries. So that the human condition is not something that is unique to humans, but that even in the heavenly realm, there's also rebelling against God and breaking through the boundaries that God has set. And the boundary that has been set here is this idea that the sons of God, which is a phrase that seems to refer to some kind of angelic beings or sort of heavenly beings, that they have broken through their restricted area and have now married human women. And this creates these men of renown. In other words, either giants or superhuman figures. It's kind of like this is the beginning of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, where you've got these amazingly powerful beings. Now, let me just take you ahead a little bit to the one person in the Bible that we know of that seems to have been one of these people, and that's in chapter 10 of Genesis, where in verse 8 we're introduced to Cush. Cush was the father of Nimrod, who became a mighty warrior on the earth. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. That is why it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. And Nimrod is understood to have been this mighty king figure. And in ancient Jewish tradition, Nimrod was a part of the building of the Tower of Babel. And so it's very speculative when you get into try to explaining this kind of stuff. But the idea is that there were these sort of heroic figures who somehow had come about through the intermarriage of heavenly figures, or like angelic figures, godlike figures, and humanity. I think the best way to think of this, I was talking to this to one of my colleagues at Regent. My colleague teaches Old Testament, and he said that this is a kind of parody of the polytheistic world of Mesopotamia. In other words, the Mesopotamian religion sort of thought that the sky was full of demigods and angelic beings of all kinds, and that they had all of this mythology about great, gods, and that this is a way of actually making those gods seem not at all impressive. So rather than thinking, oh, we should worship, all of these many gods and become polytheists, it actually shows that these so-called godlike figures are in fact like other aspects of creation that have rebelled against God, that they are under God's judgment and are in fact a part of why God's judgment came upon the world in the form of the flood. So that's all pretty complicated stuff. I think it's difficult to take it in a purely sort of historical sense, but I think it's a part of kind of interacting with the some of the great mysteries of human experience. And in particular, I think this part of chapter 6 is reflecting on something that's been here throughout this whole section. It starts from Cain. It's the mystery of evil. Is that where does evil come from? Where does bad inclinations come from? Where does rottenness of heart come from? Why is it there? Why was it even possible? And it's not that these stories answer that, but they sort of reflect on it. Because one of the things we find in this section is that God is troubled by what has come of his own creation. And so it says in chapter 6, verse 5, the Lord saw how great the wickedness of the human race had become on the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time. So that's the most damning sentence in this whole, maybe in the whole Bible, just about, certainly in this whole section of the Bible, where God says, every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart are only evil all the time. And then it says, the Lord regretted that he had made human beings on the earth, and his heart was deeply troubled. So here the story has got to its lowest point. God is deeply troubled and decides to do something about it. And this leads to in effect, the uncreation of the world. So the stories, the book of Genesis starts with the creation of the world. Then we see the decline of the human race into wickedness, and God regretting that he had made the world. And then we move into the uncreation of the world so that the world can be recreated. But there's continuity from the first creation to the second creation because of Noah, the righteous man who walks faithfully with God, who along with his family are in the ark and are given safe passage through the waters of the flood that come upon the world. So, that's what we read about in the next bit. It says in verse 11, the earth was corrupt in God's sight, was full of violence. God saw how corrupt the earth had become, for all the people on earth had corrupted their ways. So it's not just that there was this thing about the sons of God and the daughters of men. It's like everybody has become fully corrupt. They've kind of taken sort of the worst, they've followed on the ways of Cain, you could say. And so God said to Noah, I'm going to put an end to all people, for the earth is filled with violence because of that. We saw right back, Cain started violence. His grandson was talking about vengeance and all of that. And that has just continued and continued. And God now says he's going to put an end to the world. And so we've got this incredible scene of the world being filled with water. And it takes us back to, in a way, if you just think of it visually, it takes us back to the beginning of Genesis chapter 1, where there was chaos and where there was water and God had to separate the water from the water in order for there to be dry land. Remember that? God separated the waters above from the waters below, and then there was dry land, and that's where the people could live. But now the flood, in a sense, there's water from below. It says the springs came up from, like there's water from above, there's springs coming up from below, and the whole world is full of water. And there's just this one little ark. And then as the time passes, the water recedes, the clouds go up, and dry land appears again, and you've got the beginning of a new creation. So, and then out of that sort of chaos, you've got a human family appear, a man and a woman and his kids, and they start all over again. So the story of the flood and then their emergence from the flood is really a kind of do-over of the whole of creation. And there's a number of interesting kind of things that make you think about that. There's the reference, for example, in chapter 8, when God is, kind of making the flood waters recede and so on. It says he sent a wind over the earth in chapter 8, verse 1, which reminds you of the Spirit of God, which is the wind of God that was hovering over the surface of the deep all the way back in chapter 1. So it's so fascinating, but there's something that's different that comes now. At the end of the flood story, God says, okay, I'm not going to do that again. I'm not going to obliterate the whole world again in a flood. And that introduces a new element into the story, which is the story of covenant, that God makes a promise. And that theme of covenant is going to carry on down through the story. So when they come out of the ark, God says, never again, and this is chapter 8, verse 21 and following, never again will I curse the ground because of humans, even though every inclination of the human heart is evil from childhood. And never again will I destroy all living creatures as I have done. Then chapter 9 says, God blessed Noah and his sons. And that's, it's the return to blessing that we haven't had for such a long time, because there'd been the curse in chapter 3, there'd been the curse in chapter 4 because of Cain. Now finally there's a blessing again, he says. And then there's the same command that was given to Adam and Eve, which was to fill the earth. It's the same command that's given to Noah. When he comes out of the ark, it's God blessed Noah and his sons, saying to them, be fruitful and increase in number and fill the earth. So you can see how they are a kind of a new creation, a new kind of start, you could say. And so that leads us on into the rest of the story. But I'm sure you have some thoughts on some of that. Any thoughts or questions as we kind of get to the end of our time? Just got started here. There's a kind of when God is establishing kind of the rules now for the new humanity, you could say, there are some specific rules that are given that you could say kind of remind you of the Garden of Eden, where there's certain rules are given, although now these seem pretty fundamental things. So it says to be fruitful. That was the same command as before. Verse 3 says, everything that lives and moves about will be food for you. And then it says, just as I gave you the green plants, I now give you everything. So if you go back to the early story, chapter 2, it talks about how God gave them all. They were vegetarians, basically, before. That was, anyway, I don't know if they were vegetarians, but that was what they were given to eat, was the plants. Now there's a kind of concession that you can eat anything. You can be omnivores. But there's a rule about not eating blood. So you can see the beginnings now of what will eventually become kind of a part of Israelite religion. Eventually, there's kind of foreshadowing of the worship of Israel, and one of those things has to do with the very sacred attitude towards the lifeblood of an animal. So you have to, when you slaughter an animal to eat it, you have to drain its blood out and so on, because life was understood to be in the blood, and that was sacred and so on. So you must not eat meat that has its lifeblood in it. And then it says, and for your lifeblood, I will surely demand an account. I will demand an account for every animal. And from each human being too, I will demand an accounting for the life of another human being. Whoever sheds human blood, by humans shall their blood be shed, for in the image of God has God made mankind. So that's kind of an echo, a preempting of Cain and Abel. So now it's like, okay, in case you didn't know, you're not allowed to murder each other. And then it talks about, multiplying and so on. And God says in verse 8 to Noah and to his sons, I now establish my covenant with you and with your descendants after you, with every living creature that's with you, the birds, the livestock, and the wild animals, all that came out of the ark with you, every living creature on earth. I establish my covenant with you. Never again will all life be destroyed by the waters of a flood. Never again will there be a flood to destroy the earth. And then it talks about the rainbow. And there's also this theme there of God saying, I will remember this. And the rainbow is God's way of saying, I remember this. So the covenant is going to play out in lots and lots of different ways down through the rest of the story.
So do you think that Noah and his family are real people in time and space, or do you think that they're just another
myth?
How should I say?
I think that they are, they seem like real people, don't they? But it's just they're representatives of a kind of a new beginning for the human race. So it doesn't make sense to think of them as not real people. They're real people, but the story kind of isn't just an ordinary story about something that is sort of, in a sense, mundane. It's a story about the foundations of everything. So Adam and Eve kind of belong to the ancient, just the very beginning of things. Cain is a representative of everything that went wrong with the world and went in the direction of violence. But there was a subset of the human story that starts with Seth and is in Enoch and it's in Noah, and they represent the human family who have been faithful to the Lord, who worship the Lord, and so are the ones with whom, the ones that walk with God. But interestingly, in this bit where God is making a covenant, he's not just making a covenant with the righteous part of the human people. He's making a covenant with everyone. He starts with this family, but it's even with the animals. It's with the whole earth. Never again will I destroy the water, everything with the waters of a flood. But I don't think of this as history in the sense that, you could go back and you could find, this in a history book. This is kind of like, this is somehow much more fundamental than history. It's before history. It's primordial. It's kind of the foundations of history.
I remember, sorry, just quickly, I remember reading a book one time, and one of the ideas in the book was that the account of creation is not meant to be scientific, because scientific theories and ideas change all the time. So the account of creation was written so that it would be true in any culture. It would express truth in any culture. At the same time, I'm looking at some of the specifics, like the length of the time the people lived in each generation. And I remember that that same genealogy is recounted in some of the Gospels as well. There are some differences, I think, but it's kind of like it's justified by its repetition in the Gospels. And so I think some of the specific things in Genesis are actually quite happened just the way it's said, but the things that are maybe I'm not sure how to explain it, but things that are maybe not so specific are still true as they are, but with expressing the truth in a way that it can be understood at any generation.
Thanks, Alan. I think that sounds interesting. I think the idea of this is true kind of for any generation. I think that's an interesting way to think about it. That's cool. Thank you. Well, what do you think, Dan?
We got a hand up here from Clayton. Why don't you go
I
ahead?
can't hear
Clayton?
a word you're saying though.
Oh, go ahead, Clayton. I think you're on mute, but go ahead.
Who's going ahead?
Oh, sorry
there we
about
go.
that.
Yeah, you're good.
Paul, one thing I think that's strange in the Noah and the flood story, with Genesis 1-4, you've got, like you said, another kind of fall or rebellion. And then it's almost like God has to bring judgment because the world becomes so corrupt. And then, but then afterwards, he makes the covenant. And I think that's really mysterious and strange. And I don't know how to really articulate the question, but I wondered if you could comment on that a little bit.
No, I think, Clayton, that, you know, sometimes the worst thing you could do is explain it, you know. So that's what I was saying about sitting around the fire. You know, it's like, it's the sort of thing where you should just sort of sit with someone else and talk about it. It's like, what about this bit? And what about that bit? And because there's sort of layers of the story that will kind of tease out, you know, as you talk about it, but with yourself, if you just think it through, you'll say, but what about this? And then, hang on, this other bit, that's interesting too. And then it'll remind you of something, could be from the Psalms or something Jesus said, or I mean, often it's so human. Like, it's just, but this is what it's like, isn't it? I mean, this is this is our problem, you know, like, so to me, if you kind of, it's, you don't want you know, you have to be careful with it, you know, if you just dig into it too much and you just like peel it apart and it's like figured it all out, and then the whole thing's broken in front of you, and then you've lost it. So these stories just require sitting and reflecting. And I just saw the line there that, what did Linda say? We need to sit with the mystery. That's right. I like that. There's something deeply human about these stories, deeply mysterious, and yet also so kind of close to us, where you kind of go, yeah, this is something interesting. But there's insight, right? I think that's what I think we seek when we read, you know, the scripture like this. Is you trust that the Lord will give you an insight into oneself, into the human condition, into, you know, one of the questions that we had earlier on is like, why did Jesus have to die? Well, because the human inclination is this, you know. So it's the reason that Jesus died is not because someone ate an apple in a garden. It's because there's this much deeper truth about the human dilemma and the human propensity to go in a certain way. But notice how the Creator doesn't abandon the world, right? So even though he limits them, kicks them out of the garden, you know, has this punishment for Cain, there's other kinds of constrictions and restrictions, and then there's the flood, which is massive. But God refuses to just abandon it and say, that's it, I'm done. I'm gonna go to another world and just destroy this one. So that theme of covenant is really, really important, because it speaks of God's persistence. God persists and he doesn't go away. Even though God is also mysterious and hard to figure out. Like, you don't really know. Like, God's relationship to Cain, for example, is strange. Like, why was the one sacrifice or the one offering acceptable and the other one wasn't? You know, that's never explained. So God isn't entirely accessible. Like, God is there, but you're kind of like, I'm not sure what God's doing. But God persists. He doesn't abandon, he doesn't relinquish, he sticks with his creation. And that's why we've got the story that eventually becomes the story of Abraham's family and all of that. So So there's a lot more to do there. So I think that's good for tonight.
That's great. God persists and will persist again next Thursday
Yeah,
at
awesome.
8 p.m. Thanks, Paul. Thanks, friends,
Thanks
for
so
being
much,
here.
everybody. Lovely to see you all. Blessings.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, Paul.
Take care.
Thanks.
You're welcome.
And apologies for those who we couldn't have time for your questions here, but thanks for sending the chats there. That's always great to see those questions pop up.